So now we're going to learn both if statements and nested if statements. And this is a real data set that we're going to use as an example. So the details of the experiment which generated this data isn't really important, but I just want to give you some details so you at least have a sense of the data that you're working with. So this is nitrogen volatilization data from an experiment where we looked at different ways of applying nitrogen fertilizer to corn, and then we measured loss, nitrogen volatilization loss, gaseous losses of nitrogen with chambers. I'm just going to show you some photos right now. These are the chambers that we use to measure nitrogen loss. And so we have our plot sizes. We don't have the plots outlined here, but we have each plot had 4 chambers in it. And you can see actually in the back here, you can see 4 chambers, in one of the plots, another 4 chambers here in one of the plots. I'll give you another photo here. This is when the corn was much taller, and you can see we have 2 chambers. You can only see 2 chambers. The other 2 are kind of hidden by the foliage. But we have different ways of applying nitrogen, and you can actually notice that we were injecting nitrogen in this example, and you can see the outline. Let me just give a couple of details on the data set itself. It might help you understand what we're doing here. Not super important. Really, we're focusing on if statements and nested if statements, but to understand the data set. So this column is the location. The study was done in 5 different locations. We're focused here on just one location, Winchester. Then we have the calendar date. So these measurements were taken in 2021. And we have the start of the measurements on July 8th. And then we actually, if you follow down, we finished measuring on July 28th. So every plot had measurements taken from July 8th to the 28th. This column is just the plot number. We had 24 plots that we were measuring, so you hear the plot number. Column D is the for our treatment for our TRT. This is actually the variable of interest. This was the treatments we imposed, which was the way or the method of applying the nitrogen fertilizer. So here you have UAN injected, so we were injecting the nitrogen fertilizer into the soil. And here you have, for example, UAN surface, where we were just kind of dribbling it onto the surface. We weren't injecting the nitrogen fertilizer in the soil. Okay. Next, we have chamber number. So as I mentioned, every plot had 4 chambers. Now, we numbered these chambers 1 to 4. So we were, for example, every day or every 2 days, we were measuring, volatilization measures from chamber number 1. And so if we measured, volatilization measured from chamber number 1, we used the exact same chamber the next day when we were measuring. So we kept track of what chambers we were recording the loss measurements from. And why were we doing this? So of the 4 chambers, 2 were controls and 2 were not controls. Now the control here was we placed a chamber on a patch of bare soil that didn't get any nitrogen fertilizer. So if it said control yes, so here, these were measuring volatilization from the bare soil, not the nitrogen fertilizer. Now, if we had a control that said no, now this was volatilization, not from the bare soil, but from the fertilizer itself. We put the chamber right on where the fertilizer was applied. Okay, now, won't get into too much of the details, but again, of the 4 chambers, we have 2 were controls and 2 were not controls. Then we have the emission factor. This is the loss of volatilization, so the nitrogen lost in kilograms of nitrogen per hectare that the chamber was recording. And so, here is 1 kilogram per hectare. Here's 2.1 kilograms per hectare, 0.8 kilograms per hectare that day, or in that interval of measurement interval. So that's how much loss we were getting. And what we're going to do right now with our if statement is scale this emission factor. And I won't get technical here about why we're scaling, but we have to scale these down to reflect the area of the chamber. Okay, so our mission, or your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to transform the data in this column, emission factor, transform it and enter it into this column, scaled emission factor. We got to scale the data using these rules that we have here, the scaling. And basically the rule is, for a given chamber, a given date and a given plot, is that chamber a control? Yes or no? And then is that plot or is that chamber in a plot that has the UAN injected or the UAN surface? Yes or no? All right, let's start writing our if statement. Now, we actually need a nested if statement here to actually get our emission factor scaling correct, because we have to evaluate whether the chamber is a control or not, yes or no, and if the chamber is in a plot that had the UAN injected versus surface applied. But let's just focus on whether we're in a control, yes or no, because or actually the first couple of rows are all UAN injected anyway. Okay, so we're going to start with our if statement. We write equals if open bracket. Now we're prompted for 3 values here. First is the logical test. That's what we're asking Excel to evaluate. So the logical test output will either be true or false. So if the logical test is true, if statement will output 1 value. If the logical test is false, it'll output a different value. So let's again focus on whether we're in a control, yes or no. So I'm going to write if, and then I want to say, okay, is the control equal to, and then in quotation marks, yes. And because we're working in characters or text, we need quotation marks. If this is a number, say greater, less than, or equal to a number, we don't need quotation marks, but for text we do, comma. So if control is equal to yes, the logical test will be equal to true, and then if statement will output this value equal to true, which we want to multiply the emission factor by 0.85 in this case, 0.85. And if the logical test is false, then we know that we're not in a control chamber, and so we're going to multiply the emission factor by 0.15 or 15%, and then we close bracket. Okay, so I'm just going to drag this down a little bit, and you can see I have the answer here. And you can see, the if statement is correct. So one thing to keep in mind is that I'm not asking if the values in the control column, column F, is equal to yes or no. I'm just asking if it's equal to yes. And I'm assuming that if it's not equal to yes, then it must be equal to no. But let's say, I could have, say, apple here. It doesn't matter. I could have, a cat. And, it doesn't really matter, but this is evaluating this if statement is if the cell F5 in this case is equal to yes or not. And so if I have multiple possible values in my my control column, then I want to be more specific. All right, now let's focus on our nested if statement. And I just want to give you the framework before we start running it out. So okay, we have one of 4 possible scaling values that we're going to multiply our emission factor by. So first, we're going to ask our if statement to do one logical test, which is if we're in UAN injected or not, if we're part of UAN injected or UAN surface. And then once we figure that out, we nest another if statement that is going to tell us, are we in a control, yes or no? And based on the answer to those 2 questions for our treatment, control, yes or no, then we're going to multiply our emission factor by one of these 4 values. Let's build our if statement. And we have this one that we just wrote, but I'm going to delete it. I could have kept it, but it's just going to be clear to see, understand what's going on. So first I'm going to write my if statement, and I want to know if we're in the UAN injected or UAN surface treatment. So I'm going to write if D2, because that's the column that that has that information, and I'm using quotation marks because this is a character or text. Injected has to be exactly the same writing. So if D2 is equal to UAN injected, then we're going to go, okay, what happens if that's true? Now, if that's true, then I have to go, okay, well, are we in a control chamber or not? So I need a nested if statement. I need another if statement because that's going to help us over here. So are we in UAN injected? Yes, we are, because we're going if the value is true, that's what we're looking at right now. So if we are in UAN injected, then we want if yes, we'll just keep it the same as last time. So if F2 is equal to yes. So if we're in UAN injected, yes. If F2 is equal to yes, then we're going to be multiplying our emission factor by 85%. So times 0.85. And if we're not in a control chamber, we're multiplying it by 15%, 0.15. And then we close that if statement. Okay, so what have we done so far? We've said, okay, are we in UAN injected, yes or no? If we are in UAN injected, if this is true, then we go to this if statement, which is that are we in a control or not? So now what we have to do is if our first if statement is false, that is, if we're not in UAN injected, and we'll assume that we're in UAN surface. We're assuming there's only 2 possibilities. You're in UAN injected or UAN surface. So if we're not in UAN injected, well, we need another if statement to tell us, okay, well, we're in UAN surface, but are we in a control chamber or not? And then we're multiplying by 70% or 35%. So I go back here to control. And again, we'll just do equal to quotation mark yes. And if we are in a control, we're going to be multiplying our emission factor by 0.7 and multiplied by 0.7. And if we're not in control, if F2 is equal to anything except yes, then we're multiplying by 30%. And then we close that. And then we close our final if statement. And that's it. All right, so this is our nested if statement. It's really big, and it's very common to have errors in the if statement. So it's good to double check by playing around. So here, here we have our emission factor, and we're scaling it correctly. We're scaling it by multiplying by 15 or 85% based on whether we're in a control or not. Let's now do UAN surface and see if that will update the values. Okay, and it does. So you can see now instead of 85 and 15, it's 70% and 30, or 0.7 and 0.30, which is exactly what we would expect for the UAN surface treatment. We can also, futz around by changing these values up and seeing how our if statement responds. And it's working pretty much as anticipated. So that's how you do the if statement.